Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dan Rayburn. I teach nonfiction writing here at the University of Chicago. I want to welcome you all on this Thursday afternoon, the first week of our spring quarter, and the second day of our literary arts lab. And we're very lucky to have 4 guests with us today. The anthropologist Lewis Hyde wrote one of my favorite books about being a writer, being an artist. It's a book, if you're ever lucky enough to go to the MacDowell colony, that they kind of foist on you while you're there. And I read it while I was there, and it talks about how art and writing in particular is a gift economy. And I'm thinking about that because one thing this pandemic has done is made us realize the way things already were before it hit. And one of the things I've realized is that writing is these books and these authors, it's a real gift. This is my favorite part of my job, to be able to bring the writers whose books rocked my world here and introduce them to you. And that's how we pass these gifts along. It's also just a gift to be a part of this literary festival and this great team we have. I just want to throw out a few names there. Jesse, Starsha, and Annette, you guys are the rock of this program, and nothing here would happen without the 3 of you. And I just want to thank you guys for everything you've done, not just this year, but every year before it. But this year has made me realize more than ever how essential you are to events like this. I wanted to thank John Wilkinson, my colleague Vu Tran, and Suzanne Buffum, who did a lot of the orchestration here as well. I know you guys are out there. Just want to say I see you, and thank you so much for bringing us all here. So these are 4 writers with 4 books in particular I'm going to focus on today that I've been teaching in my classes for a long time. And I'm going to skip the usual literary introduction, the recitation of books published, magazines published in, and awards won. It's just simply too long. And it's important, but it's not the most important thing right now. I think the most important thing is just to talk super briefly about why these 4 writers need to be on this one panel together. So first we have Valeria Luiselli, and this book right here, Tell Me How It Ends. It's a book about working as a translator, helping children, migrants who've been denied their personhood. And it's about working within that system, the so-called system, this broken immigration system, and how storytelling fits into that, to that denied personhood of these kids. The other author we have coming from Tucson is Francisco Cantu, and this is his book, The Line Becomes a River. And I've long wanted to bring you 2 here because I see these books as sort of a yin and yang. Francisco was working as a Border Patrol agent, I think because he got into this so-called immigration system because he wanted to change it from within. And so his job is to sort of be a part of the system that also denies migrants their personhood. So in a way, he and Valeria are on almost opposite sides of the problem, but they're on the same side up here and in here. And I think that's what makes these 2 books so interesting in combination. And then we have Kathy Hong, this book here, Minor Feelings, which just rocked my world when I read it a few weeks ago. I actually, as I was highlighting it, I actually had to text Vu and say, like, where has this book been all my life? I think it's very much a part of these books because it's also a book about being a person, being a human, but feeling kind of dehumanized and being inside of a culture that's denying you your personhood. And it too is an essay, very much of an essay, which contains many different forms. But it's it's of a piece with, I think, the first three writers' books, and part of a tradition that I think goes back to Adrian Rich and Split at the Root and Baldwin, people who were split at the root in very fundamental and super interesting ways. And then last, we have my colleague, Mitchell Jackson, this book here, Survival Math, which I've been teaching in conjunction with this novel, The Residue Years, that I kind of see it as working in concert with as well. And it too is about personhood and feeling sort of dehumanized. I just think at its root, like all four of these books, what they have in common is that the author has been dehumanized in some way. Even though they are fully human on the page, it's either the legal system or the immigration system, or in Mitch's case, the entire state of Oregon, or perhaps the poetry industrial complex in Kathy's case, that has left them sort of feeling like, I need to talk about this. And I need to do it in a first person voice. So all that said, I'm going to throw out the first question to the four of you and ask if you could just talk a little bit about your personal experience of writing in the first person, singular, that I voice, that essayist's voice, and talk a little bit about what its disadvantages are and its advantages relative to the other forms you've worked in, poetry, straight reporting, or fiction.
Who's jumping in?
You are, Mitch.
In anticipation of this, I went back and I studied with this editor named Gordon Lish some years back, maybe a decade or so ago. And I went back to my notes, which were insufficient, but I started like an email chain asking people what they remembered about, because Gordon preaches that first person is like the only worthwhile POV. So I was trying to recall what he was saying about that. So I'm basically just going to parrot some of the things that were shared with me that kind of jogged my memory about what Gordon said. The first thing he said was the Aboriginal voice is a voice of your parents, and that's the first I, and that we're always trying to approximate our Aboriginal voice. He also said the action of composition is to reduce the distance between the subject and the object, or in other words, between the writer and the reader, until they are one. And another thing he said was, don't efface yourself, individualize yourself. So I'll stop there with three. I like things in three, but I think all of those things are getting at like this kind of removal of distance. And when Gardner talks about direct presentation, or like presenting something without a filter, like I feel like the first person is our closest chance at presenting something without a filter, even though it's still a kind of persona.
I'll pick up on that a little bit, Mitch, to say something short and then see how we thread this. But I like that idea of reducing the distance and the first person persona being like a way to reduce the distance between reader and writer. And it makes me think that like which kind of first person voices or first person narrators or personas I like the most. And I think it's those whose voice is a little quieter, that there isn't such a like an imposition of voice, but rather like a suggestion of gaze. And I think that is compelling to me, because it's when that gaze is compelling and it's kind of a quiet voice that just observes otherness or other things and other people in the world, that I as a reader can inhabit that first person persona fully. That is complete reduction of distance and gaze through the eyes of that writer. And that's when I think of personal essay, I like to think that it is personal because we are being we borrow a set of eyes, right? A set of other person and another person's eyes, and not personal because those eyes are looking at themselves, right? I think there's a great misunderstanding that personal essays is all about like myself, 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 and only myself. But what is most interesting usually about the personal essay is when that gaze does, I mean, when it does offer, of course, like an introspection, but can also be turned outward and lend us that gaze towards outside.
I can jump in.
Oh,
Oh no, you go, Kathy.
no, you go ahead.
Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think what's interesting to me, if I think about like the writing of my own book, which I really feel is what brought me into the realm of thinking of myself as a writer and thinking about craft, like a lot of that happened in an MFA program for me. And I know there's a lot of students on the call. So, like that was very magical and important because it was taking, the first person in a lot of ways is like the most obvious place that we start from. My book grew out of, like the earliest iterations of this writing grew out of my journal entries, that I kept during this time in my life working on the border. But I think what's become even more interesting to me now is sort of when and how we deviate from the I, and in the essay, how we make those moves beyond the realm of our own personal experience. And I think that where the I becomes very interesting. Not to say that the more direct experience of the I, recounting personal experiences is not interesting, but how to guide the reader's attention towards questions or histories, or things that might not be directly experienced by the author. I think that's really interesting. And lately I've been writing a series of essays that is kind of, they're rooted really heavily in like in trips that I've taken, like physical pilgrimages to different landscapes. And it becomes interesting like how to sort of incorporate some of these moves and questions that I think I have always associated more with like cultural criticism, or like this authoritative voice that we often read in magazines or newspapers, or literary journals, and how to sort of um, use those tools in a way that feels more personal and like gentle and like less exclusionary, and authoritative than I feel, often, like the cultural critic, the critic's voice feels like an exclusionary voice that like doesn't invite all readers. It like invites people who are familiar with the canon, or who are familiar with like, history as seen from this perspective, which is often like a very privileged and white institutional view. So I think that those the I is also like a comfort that I return to. Like I feel naked without the I sometimes. Like if I was just like writing an op-ed or something like that, I'm like, oh, like when do I get to move out of these paragraphs back into the I? So I think it's powerful, but it's very much an evolving thing for me. It's like an open question.
I thought there were really good points made so far. My relationship to the first person changed as I changed genres from poetry to essay. I have to say that in poetry, I was, in fact, very suspicious of the first person, because I think there was, just the traditions in which the first person is used. And I'm thinking about the romantic tradition of the I as this kind of, this whole kind of cohesive soul, this cohesive persona, and also kind of the I as the IEYE as this sort of observer, as this kind of objective observer, and so forth. So when I write poetry, I was always sort of kind of poking holes at this notion of the first person and the complete self, by always sort of ventriloquizing the I and always speaking in some, like, I always like to, you know, I spoke in drag, I like to say, you know, I would, you know, write from the perspective of a cowboy from the 19th century, or like, you know, a tour guide speaking in pidgin, or and so forth. So it was always a persona in which I draped the I in. And then, and I think I was almost anti-autobiographical as a poet, which is rather contrary of me, because, you know, when you think of poetry, you think of it as a very autobiographical genre. And then I think it was a challenge to myself to finally to dare. It was almost a dare I posed upon myself to write in the autobiographical mode using the first person. And I tried to do it with poetry, and I couldn't do it with poetry because I treat the lyric form as the song, and I couldn't sing about my life. I needed to talk about my life or explain my life. And so and I think, like, you know, I didn't know it at the time, but when I you know, unconsciously, when I was writing Minor Feelings, I was, the question was a question that I never really answer is there an Asian American consciousness? And what is the Asian American consciousness? And I don't answer it. It's not a prescriptive book, which I think has frustrated some people. But in that question, it was very important to me. And that what the essay allowed was this very kind of capacious form in which I could just really really kind of map out the movements of my mind, So this first person was sort of almost like a needle to thread all of my conflicted, contrary thoughts together, you know. And so I would double back, and I never was interested in making certitudes, but more, or if I were to, I would then double back and then question it as well. The whole, I mean, which is also part of the tradition of the essay, is to question. And I agree with Francisco about the power of using I, and also this I as a subjective tool, because I think, you know, in my book, I quote Trinity Minha about writing nearby. Especially if you're writing across cultures, across experiences, how it's important to write near yourself, you're nearby the subject that you're writing about, so that when you're using the first person, you're acknowledging that you don't have this totalizing knowledge of this subject, that your knowledge of the subject is partial, that it's and you're also acknowledging the proximity, the distance between you and the subject. And so that was also very important for me in the use of the first person, was that even when I was talking about Asian American condition, I was talking about my own subjective subject position in relation to Asian American perspective. And that's where the first person was really important as well.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that. I think it's really, really important, and something that the first person allows, perhaps more than any other.
Yeah.
If you're speaking within a community, but there is no such thing as one gaze from a community, right? Like there's just not one single gaze. There's so many different intersections of experience and class differences and just personal differences, and it is really important and this is something that I thought a lot about when I was writing Tell Me How It Ends. And it was like, okay, I'm speaking definitely within, as a member of the Hispanic or the Latinx community, call it what you want. And I am also speaking as a close observer of a situation, an ongoing situation in the court of immigration, listening to sort of both languages, sort of trying to understand what's going on in this space. But I'm also speaking within that community as a very privileged member of that community, one that didn't arrive to the United States by foot, but rather on an airplane with a student visa and a scholarship to study, right? So how do I occupy this space, the book itself, as one in which I can make the best use of the space that I occupy within this community, right? And I mean, it's all very always circumstantial, right? The space that you can occupy and what you can do with the spaces that you occupy within your community. In the moment when I was writing that book, it was still the Obama administration. So most people, except those who are constantly worried and reading about immigration, most people were like, oh, everything's fine. You know, the Obama administration no one thought that no one wanted to see that it was one of the most atrocious in terms of immigration policies, and particularly in its response to this diaspora of children, minors arriving in the US seeking asylum. So there my position was doubled. Like, how do I get to occupy this space to convince a community of liberal, kind of like-minded readers that this is actually really important and not to be relegated to silence and invisibility just because it's not on headlines anymore, right? So the other questions there, and then finally, for like I speak Spanish and read and write in Spanish as well. There was a moment in which I had to self-translate this book into Spanish, tell me how it ends. I wanted someone else to translate it, but my editors in Mexico convinced me that I was already a traitor to my Madre Patria and the Virgin of Guadalupe and my own mother by having written this book in the language of the empire. So they made me sign. We had a meeting in a cantina in Mexico City, and after 4 tequilas, I was signing a serviette saying that every book I dare write in the language of the empire, I would rewrite in Spanish myself. And I did this book. And there the I is like when you've used an I speaking within a language that is borrowed somehow, or a language that came later in your life, which is my case with English, and then you move back to your mother tongue, there's this weird shift, this kind of tectonic movement. And in the case of this book, something that I was glad about, I was glad that my editors were such bullies and made me rewrite the book myself, is that in this book is originally in the original English essay before it became this book, was fighting with the United States primarily and with the United States immigration system, without having to look at the role that Mexico plays in this particular diaspora and the story, and the horrible role that the Mexican government plays, and also just the hemispheric connectivity in this crisis of the USA, Mexico, and Central America as a region that you cannot kind of isolate, you can't atomize. And when I was able to write in Spanish, I was able to understand the much greater complexity of the topic of the two linguistic communities that I was really writing about. So yeah, that's, I guess, another thing about sort of the bilingualness of the I, what happens to how it fragments, or how it can actually become a much more complex thing.
If I could just jump in really quick, Valeria, to ask a follow-up question. I'm going to paraphrase a line from the end of your essay in 40 Questions, where you said, ultimately, stories have to be told again and again. A story has to be told again and again, over and over, from many different angles and in many different voices, before we can begin to understand it. Before, I think you said, before the stories start to bifurcate and turn into a knot that turns in on themselves. And I was just wondering if that's a function of this connectivity you're talking about, with like La Bestia running all the way up to the United States and funneling all these stories back and forth, the sort of impossibility of calling a single story. You know, they're always a collective of stories. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's always this larger story, and our story is only one thread among them. And I just think like you were very aware of that in the process of translating these kids' stories. Does that make sense? The question I'm asking?
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes very much sense, and not only in this particular context as diaspora, but it also makes sense. I mean, if you think about it historically, like the people writing now, like Paco or like me, about this moment in immigration history, in immigration of Central American and Mexican people to the U.S., or like Reina Grande or Carla Cornejo, the people writing about this right now are leaving behind one layer of a story, right? And a layer that later will just be archived, right, for others to consult and refute and think about. And particularly with respect to the children and teenagers who are this diaspora, they're still young, so they're not writing about this themselves, but eventually some of them, I hope many of them will, there'll be stand-up poetry, there'll be movies, there'll be speeches, there'll be something from this generation that remains silent still now because of their age, because of their circumstances. And I think that every other layer left behind these years is for them going to be something to mine, in the best sense of the word mining, if there is a good sense of the word mining, maybe not. Something to something to refute, something to use as one layer that can be made much more complex. But it has to exist. That layer has to be one. No one can ever write in a vacuum, right? You're always in conversation with others and what came before you. And so yeah, in that sense, every testimony is valuable, even the bad ones, even the ones that are badly written, even the ones that are fucked up in their points of views. Everything is valuable, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm thinking of what you said earlier, Francisco, about and what you said, Valeria, about how you like a first person narrator who is not so much the singular voice, but the set of eyes that allow you to see into other worlds and allow you, that are basically your virtual reality. Like I like to tell people that the essay is the original virtual reality tool. It's a technology. That first person is how we put ourselves into somebody else's head and allows them to get inside our head. And it's still the best tool for that. But one thing I sensed, like reading your book, Francisco, and yours, Valeria, too, is that your role was more of witness and observer, more like a closer to documentary than what we think of as traditional memoir, where your personal internal feelings are on center stage. And so I'm just wondering what the four of you think about that, because I think it gets at the question of, like, to put it rudely, since we've all written arguably memoiristic work, the question of narcissism, which always gets thrown at us. Anybody who writes a memoir or a first person book gets called a narcissist behind their back or on Twitter. I mean, I personally did it myself until I wrote a memoir. Now I can't do it anymore. But I think it's a deep misunderstanding about the nature of the essay in particular, and the memoir as well. But I do think there's a grain of truth to it. And I'm wondering how the four of you kind of struggled with that. Like, I know, Kathy, you have, you talk about the modular essay, so it contains many other forms. So you're really only deploying the first person story strategically at certain points to back up like larger, like basically intellectual and historical and cultural points you're trying to make. And I think, like, for example, Francisco's personal story is only there to illustrate how dehumanizing it is to work within a large governmental system. And I think Valeria's was too. And Mitch in Portland, that's a whole nother ball of wax too. And I would like to get to that. But I'm just wondering how you guys approach this, and what your fears are while you're writing in first person.
Well, I think with me, at least, there are, you know, I mean, when we're talking about the single story, for instance, like the only way to kind of knock it down is what Viet Nguyen talks about, narrative plenitude, right? Having a multiplicity of many different narratives from many different circumstances. And my book was to ask a question, a set of questions to help open up the floodgates for more of these stories to come forth. I think I tend to resist these genres. I understand that we have to have these genres, like, because it's funny coming from poetry, there's no distinction between fiction and nonfiction, and memoir and reportage or anything. I mean, we have other boundaries, genre boundaries, but I do, but I was thinking how it was really important for me to not only write about my, you know, when I talk about the modular form, it was really important for me not to just write about my own experience in sort of that singular memoiristic way, because I think when perhaps by default, what a reader does is read a memoir and say, oh, that was a terrible experience. I was in that person's shoes for a while. Now I've exited, and now I know what it's like to be that person. And then that's it. And so there we're seeing, you see the limitations of empathy and compassion and sort of living vicariously through a person's position. And I think for me, it was important to kind of offer my experience, but also historical experiences of other Asian Americans, but also other experience of friends of mine, as well as reaching outside the Asian American, so-called Asian American experience, and write about the Black experience or the Latinx experience, to kind of show how whatever grievance that I may have, or grief, or rage, or minor feelings, is not singular. It's not just me, but it's collective. And because it's collective, it's structural. You know, it's a complex of affects that are that is generated by sort of the capitalist white supremacist regime that we live in, and not an isolated experience where I've had a traumatic life and then people can sympathize with it and then move on to the next sympathetic life. And I think this is why there are also limitations to, I wrote an essay about this called Against Witness, but where there are limitations to just being a witness, right? To write about another, because as Susan Sontag says, you know, oftentimes the reader doesn't put herself on the same map of suffering as the victim, which, and you know, and so I think that was something, and that's very hard to write about, right? Is in a memoir, book of poems or fiction or something, is to also write about your own complicity, or, you know, how you yourself are accountable, but also how the reader is accountable to, or could be accountable. So how do you, and that's something, that was another kind of rhetorical approach that I was struggling with. How do I write in such a way where the reader doesn't just feel sympathetic, but also feels accountable in some way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Francisco, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, because I know when your book came out, you know, some people like gave you a lot of flack for writing, not just being a Border Patrol agent, but writing about it in the way that you did. I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that, and how that relates to like the persona of author. Like, you are your own character, right? And I think those people were not making the distinction between the narrator of your book and the character you play in it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it also sort of intersects with what Kathy mentioned as sort of like the position of witness as like often being sort of like on the same spectrum as like voyeur, you know. And I wrote that book from a position of like absolute power, right? I mean, being a law enforcement agent is like some of the most absolute power you could have in this nation. Um, and I mean that, and I understand that now in ways I couldn't have possibly understood it then. But I think um, it makes me think of what Valeria was talking about on just this like really basic level. Um, you know, you have to think about the conversations that are happening around an issue and a place, and you have to think about the position from which those stories is most often told, and sort of the places where the I, the EYE, um, is usually situated when those stories are being told. And so, I was making a pretty similar calculation to Valeria, in that, I was in the Border Patrol during the Obama years. And as somebody who was living and working on the border, part of this calculation was the alarm at seeing, um, like right now in the headlines, we're talking again about like a border crisis. And crisis to me implies some sort of like temporality of like things are really bad right now, and like the things that are happening right now are worse than usual. But I mean, this is just like an ongoing, like decades long, lifelong crisis of just like where violence and imperialism and like philosophical like political control and terrain has been shaped into like this zone of exception. um Whereas like the border is always talked about as like a frontier still. Like, I mean, it's insane when you really look at like the rhetoric of the past and the Wild West and expansion. It's like it's almost paralyzing to come to grips with with how little that rhetoric has changed, right? Like, it's updated, the semantics are slightly more polished, but it's the same. um and so I think the calculation is like, where has our eye arrived, and what has our eye seen, that needs to be, that is not being penetrated, that is not um you know fully entered in the conversation in ways that we think is important. I mean, I think like these are some of the calculations that we're making as writers. And I also think about that question that you asked, Dan, around that charge of like self-centeredness, in writing in the first person or writing from the I. And I think that like that charge is very often one that silences, right? And it's like, it's no mistake. Like that idea perpetuates the same people with the same access to platforms to having their voices being told, telling the same stories like over and over again. And I think like what Valeria said that really resonated with me, is, you know, um, I don't think anybody on this panel as a writer ever imagines or hopes to have their book, or their voice or their essay or their take be like the one and only take. Like here, there's this urge, like when people are blurbing or reviewing a book, to be like the one book you need to read about immigration, or and it's like so absurd, because like it's the last thing that an author wants. Like, you want to be inviting people into like a rich ongoing conversation with deep history, and it's an honor to be a contributor in that conversation and to participate in that conversation. But you want to invite readers into the parts of the conversation that they haven't been tuned into, or the parts of the conversation that have that don't have a shiny PR team or whatever, or that are getting buried in the headlines. And so I think that the more that we're writing about these issues from all these different angles, like as from the angle of like perpetrator or victim, or as long as it's like critiquing the institutions of power, I think that like no matter what the entry point is, it's valuable, because you never know what a reader's entry point into being having their thinking transformed around an issue is going to be.
Mm. One of the things I've always felt and told my students is that as an essayist or a memoirist, and to be honest, I'm increasingly unsure what the difference between those two is. You're kind of working between two polarities. One is my experience is significant. My experience is significant. On the other hand, you're writing with the knowledge that my experience is ultimately relatively insignificant. And I think you're always kind of trying to toggle between those two extremes as you write. And I have a note to myself here, no matter what, make sure you ask Mitch about a move he made in his memoir that I admired so hugely, which was to intersperse his first person story with stories of other people told in the second person. And I was wondering if you could talk about the thinking behind that, Mitch. In survival math, you have the survival stories.
Yeah, I think one that I have a kind of evolving relationship to the second person, first person, third person, because I came from fiction first, and was always having to make those decisions. I do think one of the things that I feel most comfortable with is talking about authority as it relates to first person. And I feel like I have the most authority on the page when I'm in the second person. I mean, when I'm in the first person. But I also, I like what Valeria said about not being like so self-involved, but like a first person that's actually looking out. So if I were in fiction, I could construct scenes in which the first person narrator was always looking outward or talking about another person. You don't necessarily get that, I think, in memoir essay. I actually didn't intend to write a memoir. I always thought Survival Map was a collection of essays, which to me, the distinction is like one starts with an idea, the other starts with a kind of story. So I wasn't trying to tell a story, really. I was trying to, kind of explore these ideas. But yeah, back to authority. I think the second person, if you do it right, might be the most dynamic in that it can kind of approximate the first person and the kind of intimacy you get from a first person. But then it not only invites the reader, it kind of implicates the reader, right? So it makes them a kind of co-conspirator along this journey with you and ask them, like they're constantly saying, well, who's the you in this situation, right? And I think if you do it right, the you becomes both the author and the subject in the story. So I liked that. And I thought the subject matter that I was writing about would be foreign to a lot of people that were going to read the book. And so I wanted to see if I could compress that distance between the subject, who was not me, and then the reader.
And it worked, because the feeling I had when I read these stories was, on the one hand, I would not do what this young gentleman decided to do. that was not a good idea, to take the gun out of the shoebox and go looking for that guy. On the other hand, by the end, I was forced to realize he did exactly what I would have done at the same time. I think both those things are true. And I know that sounds very kind of Zen riddle paradox, but it's true. Like, I would never do what this guy did, and yet I could totally do what this guy did. And I think the cool thing about second person is, it is trick first person. It's more commanding and it has more authority. It feels more inarguable to me, at least when it's done right. So
I feel like it takes a lot of courage to write in the second person, and I've never felt like I have that courage, because like Mitch said, it's more, I think it implicates the reader so much more directly, and I think it takes like a lot of confidence um, in your position and argument, to do that so directly. Like, I always feel, like I'm always just tiptoeing. I feel like I'm very often tiptoeing in the writing process, like even if the finished product doesn't feel like it's tiptoeing around an issue. Like, I feel it's, and part of that is probably from writing in the first person. You're so conscious of like what do I have the position, experience, and direct knowledge of to say in the first person. And so I think like I can imagine it being very liberating. I'm really curious about trying to write in the second person now, especially after listening to this conversation.
But you kind of did a version of that, Francisco, because you went out of your way when you were narrating your story to let your fellow Border Patrol agents speak at, in short but carefully chosen passages where they told their story, basically. I'm thinking of the guy from Detroit, and like, so you do kind of, it's still in the first person embedded within your first person, but it does have the effect of making us empathize and understand why these Border Patrol agents are doing their job, even at the same time that you and I, and at least I, felt kind of alienated from them too, because we see them doing really dehumanizing, horrible things like destroying caches of food and water in the desert and things like that. But you do sort of help the reader with these insertions understand why they're doing what they're doing. And so I kind of thought of them as like the second people in the story, in addition to yours.
I think of that as almost like oral history. Like I think a lot about um, when we're not speaking from our own knowledge, like turning the typical platform to, I feel like the typical thing we inherit as nonfiction writers is like the journalistic reportage style of sort of like, this person told me this, and then like taking a lot of liberties with that story and with that person's experience in like rendering it with our own like writerly flourishes. And I feel like I learn a lot from oral history, thinking about somebody like Svetlana Alexievich and like Voices from Chernobyl or something like that, and the power of sort of curating certain moments of people speaking directly themselves. Yeah, because I think that long sustained time in the voice of someone else, I think that helps us critique things from different positions, right? And if like the goal is to be trickling up to critique these institutions of power or the existence and creation of this dynamic of power in the first place, I think it's important to see that it's not like it's not as easy to sort of reduce villains into like these one-dimensional stories. And I think like we actually have more tools for critiquing the institutions of power when we look at them from these different entry points, if that makes sense.
It does. And we have 8 minutes left. So I want to just ask one of my very last question to throw it out there really quickly. So speaking for myself, like when I'm writing an essay, I always come to this point, or a memoir, I come to this point where I want to stop using the word I. And I want to stop beginning sentences with the word I. Just at a technical level, it's always a problem. A rhythmic level, it's a problem, but mostly at a conceptual level, I want to start beginning them with the word we. And the title of this panel is The Collective We. And so there's this moment when you want to kind of ascend the soapbox and start using the word we, or in some cases, the word you, but it's always tricky. It's always fraught. It always feels scary. I know it's when my students, it's the scariest moment in an essay for them. And it's usually that moment for me in my case. And I'm wondering if you guys have that feeling as well, and how that might be related to whatever your conception of like the collective is. Like, can we even use the word we right now in this polarized, diverse, wonderful society? Is the idea of a collective, of a we, is it an illusion?
There's this quote by, I was interviewing the poet Nathaniel Mackey, and he had this beautiful quote. He uses the first person all the time. And he had this beautiful quote. I asked him about his use of the we, and he said, well, I see we, to paraphrase him, he said, I see it as the we as this, ballroom sized space with double doors. and people can come and go as they please. So he's like, so the we is malleable. It's, you know, it sometimes it shrinks in size to just two people, say two lovers, for instance, or say a friend and me, or my mother and me, or it's the we is some a first person plural pronoun that expands to include all of America or the whole world, or you know, whatever demographic that you happen to be in. And that's sort of the ideal that I want to aim for, right? Is a we that's porous, that you can, where you can be invited in or not. But it was definitely a vexing question. I mean, it's perhaps the most vexed pronoun one can use in an essay, you know, and it's often used polemically in the way that the second person is also used polemically. And I think that for me, I would say for every racial group, but maybe especially for Asian Americans, there's the first person pronoun is especially vexed because we are, not only do we come, well, like Latinx people, not only do we come from many different regions, ethnicities, class, and so forth, but we're also always so flattened and interchangeable. And I think that's why Asian Americans are especially defensive about not tenting us under this first person plural. But I think if we try to change, or if we try to see the we as more porous, like the way Nathaniel Mackey talks about the first person plural, then it could be less prohibitive for people to use, you know, so.
Kathy, have you read? I've never written in we, and I don't think I will, unless it. I mean, I am working on a piece that has a kind of chorus, like a weird kind of chorus, and it's fictional. So maybe in that chorus there's a we, but I've never felt that I can use a we. But I was thinking as you were saying this, Kathy, of a poem that I teach very often. By Dolores Dorantes. The poem is called Style. And I was wondering if you'd read it or not. And if not, I highly recommend it. I think that is like it's one poem, one long poem, written in a kind of collective voice, kind of sad, fucked up, disturbing collective voice, because it's possibly not, I mean, it's never quite clear, but it's possibly a dead woman speaking, a group of dead women from Juarez, which, as maybe not all the students here know, but maybe many of you do know, is a border town between Mexico and the U.S. That had the highest, I mean, I think probably in the world, the highest rates of femicide, and particularly so in the late 90s and early 2000s. And Dolores Dorantes is from Juarez, and she wrote this poem Style while she was, I think, in Texas waiting for her asylum case. And anyway, that is a we that speaks to a you that is particularly strange and eerie. It's a you that is possibly the state, possibly the US, possibly US and Mexico, possibly the border. It's never quite clear. But in that malleability, like that, I love this image of the ballroom, because with a we that is like not quite determined, the you also becomes not quite, or can become, or in the hands of a good poet can become this enormous dark force that is sort of always moving through the poem, but never quite clearly defined. And that is, I think, a good thing for a poem, right? It's a good thing for again, it goes back to something that I think you said, Kathy, which I wrote down here, like, how do I write in a way that the reader is not just sympathetic, but is also accountable, right? And when there is malleability in the we and the you, and when there's that almost not only malleability, but an ambivalence, the reader needs to become much more active and hopefully then also much more accountable.
Oh, Valeria, you just nailed it. I love the way you wrap this up. We are unfortunately out of time, but that was the perfect ending, because I think you really answered, both you and Kathy really answered the question so well. Like, the word "we" is extremely undefined, and that is, of course, its great strength. That is not the weakness of the word. That is its great strength. And that's why there are so many different ways to use it. And it's open to so much interpretation. That's what makes using it scary, and that's what makes using it necessary, along with the first person. We have a bunch of great questions in the chat. If this were not the pandemic, we would all have a really great lunch right now, and we would discuss all of this for a lot longer. But we must sign off. I have to go teach my 3-hour class on comic books, which starts in 2 minutes. So I want to thank you guys so much for coming. And I want to encourage everybody to come tonight at 6 o'clock. Ilya Kaminsky is reading, and I believe he will be in conversation with our very own Rachel Galvin, if I am correct. So that's at 6 o'clock. I highly recommend that everybody here come. And anyway, Mitch, Kathy, Valeria, Francisco, I want to thank you guys again for being here. Thank you so much.
And Mitch, I always love seeing you. Paco, nice to see you again. Lovely to see you. Kathy, nice to meet you.
I hope we get to see each other.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
Sometime, some point.
And let's do this again. We can do the exact same event again in real time with real presence.
Yeah, it's an honor to be in conversation with y'all, and thanks to all the participants for listening to us.
Yeah. And congratulations, Kathy.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, congratulations. Big time.
Yeah. All right. Bye-bye.